The last time the power went out where we were there, it had a New Year's blackout, the whole entire island for 3 days. And then we went in April and it was the same thing. You're trying to get your work done and you can't because there's no power, right? And then so all of a sudden you don't have water. There's all these other things that sort of dovetail off of no electricity, right? It gets pretty messy. All right, welcome to Local Energy. My name is Peter Brecht. My co-host Wade Spear is out traveling still for the holidays, if you can't believe it. But I'm here today with our guest, Meredith Angwin. Meredith, how are you doing?
Fine, thank you. Glad to be here.
I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. A few weeks ago, was reading some posts on social media, and they were all about the grid and the electric grid. And I realized very quickly that I had absolutely no idea what anyone was saying on either side of the conversation. So I went on Twitter and I said, hey, any books you would recommend? And your book was shared quite quickly after. And so your most recent book is Shorting the Grid. And I know you wrote a handful of others prior to that.
Yes.
And then you have a Substack, which I love the name of, The Electric Grandma. I love that title. It's so fitting. But, I'm really thankful for the book that you wrote because, every conversation now, having read through it twice, once to educate myself and then a second time to prepare for this interview, everything's starting to make more sense to me. So there was a recent headline 2 weeks ago. Goldman Sachs says that, 8 out of 13 U.S. regional power markets are already at or below critical spare capacity levels. And before that would have boggled my mind, but now I'm able to at least sort of have an understanding of what that means and what it means for, our power going into the winter. So, maybe we could start out with a basic principle, the basics of how the power grid works. Something that I didn't know was that power has to be created and then consumed almost simultaneously. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And it's something people generally don't know. Somehow they feel, well, there's a lot of it and I'll just use some of it. But, every time you turn on a light, at some level, a power plant responds by making more power. And if you turn off a light, the power plant makes less. Now, obviously, this isn't actually happening quite that way because there's millions of people turning lights on and off and hundreds of power plants. So basically, it all kind of even out. Instead of like the light went on and now the power plant's up here and now the light went off and it's like a whole bunch of lights went on and so the power plant is gearing up. But you have to keep it in balance. If you don't keep it in balance, if there's not the same amount being produced as consumed, then the frequency on the grid will change. And the grid frequency, that is the 60 cycles per second, is held in very close requirements so that basically it can't go below 59.7 cycles per second or something like that for more than 2 minutes. And so one of the things that happens is that, let's say you have a sunny day, and so there's a lot of solar going on the grid for a few hours, but it could really swamp the grid and cause the frequency to vary. And so what happens is that usually solar is curtailed, which means that the grid operator says to the commercial solar, get off the grid right now. And then the commercial solar has said many times, hey, yeah, you can send me to go off the grid, but you know that I can only make money only a certain number of hours, and you're cutting into it. So now the solar gets a compensation payment for the time that they're not on the grid. So to some extent, solar is in a win-win situation. They're either getting paid for being on the grid or paid for not being on the grid. So,
Right.
I mean, how much better can it get than that? Now, not every solar is in that situation. The home solars are different because they don't get curtailment payments. And also, it depends on what jurisdiction you're in, because some RTOs are quick with the curtailment payments and the others aren't. Some are like, we don't do curtailment unless it's really bad. And some are like, yeah, we had to curtail you. Here's your money.
Gotcha.
It depends.
I love that it depends answer. It's always fun, as a consumer, right? As someone that bought solar, put it on our house 2 years ago, right? Because they change even the different areas. Like, okay, we'll give you this rebate or that rebate. And then you sort of start working through the math. And at times, depending on how you calculate it, it feels like they're winning. And then other times you feel like you're winning. And it just comes down to how long are you going to live there, right? It's at the end of the day, right? Hey guys, thanks for listening to this week's episode of Local Energy. Please remember to like and subscribe to us here on YouTube or Spotify, or check us out at localenergy.com. All right, back to the show.
Yeah, well, you have to think about that. I mean, power plants have to think about that too. I think it's particularly hard to get a new gas plant built, not because it's so expensive or there isn't enough gas, but
Mhm.
because there's this sort of anti-gas movement. And so people are thinking, well, I'll invest in the gas plant, but then they won't let me run it very much.
Right. In your book, and I have a copy of it on my desk. It's pretty worn out at this point, but you described yourself as a materials person. And so I thought it was interesting your perspective, and maybe you could share your background as far as your approach for writing this book, because it is different than I think somebody that is maybe on the policy side, right?
Oh, yeah.
So maybe share your background on that and how it led you into writing this book.
Well, okay, I'll start by saying I'm a chemist. I have a master's in chemistry and some work toward the PhD in geochemistry. I
Yeah.
was very interested in geology, and I was also interested in geothermal energy. So when I got out of school and I wanted to work, what I wanted to do was work somehow in geothermal energy, and I did get jobs in that. I
Okay.
learned how to, corrosion prevention, other things of that nature. Corrosion prevention and pollution prevention are the
Hmm.
two big jobs for a chemist in many industries where the output is electricity. In other words, somebody has to prevent corrosion in nuclear plants and coal plants and prevent pollution and so forth. So, which means I bounced around among many different technologies as a materials person. Now, what happened then is basically I sort of semi-retired and I was living in California and I was working in California. And then I moved to Vermont. My husband had a job in New Hampshire. The kids were both on the East Coast. And so we said, okay, we'll move to Vermont and that'll be great. And it was great, but I wasn't able to get a decent job. I did a lot of gig work. I did consulting and tech writing and all kinds of stuff, but I didn't really find a job, which was okay with me because I decided I wanted to do more writing. And
Hmm.
so I wrote a book. It was a novel. It's not published. It's a novel that took place in a nuclear plant, but it was a regular mystery. That is, people murdered each other for the usual reasons like
Yeah.
adultery and drugs or whatever, as
Okay.
opposed to the plant melted down. Usually if you read a novel that has a nuclear plant in it, that plant is doomed.
Right. Right.
But
Right.
I thought that wasn't fair,
Yeah.
because most people know more or they think they know more about what happens in a maximum security prison
Hmm.
than in a nuclear plant because
Right.
after all there are movies about maximum
Yes.
anyhow. So I wrote it and then I realized that I needed to have some highly technical people review it and I didn't know exactly where to find them in Vermont. But
Mm.
one man wrote a pro-nuclear letter to the editor and it was pretty easy to find out what his phone number was. And
Hmm.
so I called him and I said, "Hey, would you be willing to read a book for technical accuracy about nuclear?" And
Yeah.
he said, "Oh yeah, sure, that's great." And he's a very nice man. He's very nice. He's also worked at nuclear plants in Taiwan, the Midwest, and the Northeast. So
Okay.
it's like he definitely knows nuclear.
Yeah.
But at any rate, he was fighting for the continuation of Vermont Yankee. He said, "Well, if I read your book, I want you to come and be at a hearing with me about Vermont Yankee. Maybe you'll even get a chance to talk." I
Hmm.
said, "Oh, okay, sounds good." So I went there and I had never really realized the street theater that goes on at some of these hearings, the shouting and the people coming in costumes and
Mm.
it was just amazing to me. And I
Hmm.
decided more people ought to know about this. I mean, people will read about a hearing and they'll say opponents said this. They don't know that opponents shouted that. So I decided I would write a blog in favor of Vermont Yankee. So I began writing that. And it also, on occasion, mentioned how Vermont Yankee and its regulators were interacting. Net
Hmm.
result of that is some regular type people were
Right.
reading it. And they asked me if I would join a group called the Consumer Liaison Group for our grid operator. I joined it. And I really didn't know very much about what the grid operator did or what the PUC did or what.
Right.
Anyway, so the long and short of it is that I sort of had a immersion experience in grid politics or grid laws or whatever.
Right.
And I decided, unlike nuclear, where I could explain something to people relatively short,
Mhm.
uh, I could say, oh, no, you don't have to worry about X because of Y. Explaining the grid was just an endless. I mean, I'm a bit talky anyway, but it was like, it was too much. So I
Yeah.
decided I needed to write a book that people could refer to. So
Mhm.
I didn't have to start everything by saying, well, let's look at the capacity market, the energy market, and the ancillary services markets to start out. Yes, okay, now that we looked at those.
Right. No, your book it's not too technical. I read it and understood, how you were approaching it, which was great. I just appreciated, I think, the fact that it wasn't politically written. It was very much, an engineering mindset that sat down and said, okay, let's put out a thesis that the average person could understand. And so another thing that I really appreciate about your story is that you wrote something and then you made a connection and that led you to something. And then, so it's always been fun for me to see how putting yourself out there in a sense, or just making a phone call can really change kind of the direction of how you're teaching and sharing and educating and putting yourself out there. I've always found that fascinating. So really cool to see that it stays true, forever, really.
Yeah, I think it does. I think, you have to do something. And then if you're lucky that what you do will be useful, and even if you're not lucky, maybe somebody who knows something more about it will
Right.
be there to talk to you about it.
Absolutely.
Anyway, I just loved meeting Howard Schaefer and the other people who worked at nuclear plants. Even though I had been at nuclear plants, I'd only been in the chemistry labs. I
Mhm.
hadn't been all over the place.
Getting back to the grid a bit, when someone says, hey, our grid is fragile, we hear that, see that quite commonly. And it's something that you would, I think, agree with in terms of, reading through everything. But when someone says the grid is fragile, what do they mean by that?
Well, they mean that it's easy to break. I mean, if
Yeah.
fragile, it means easy to break.
Does that mean that we're at risk of having no power or only certain areas, or that there's a larger infrastructure problem? Like, and how do we fix it, I guess, is the other problem, right? Which is a much longer answer, I'm sure.
Well, that's a very long answer. Let me explain fragile. So, for example, let's look at California, which has been having what they call flex alerts almost every evening and
Hmm.
in the summer.
Hmm.
And basically, they say, okay, please don't use your electricity tonight or
Yes.
between 4 o'clock and 9 o'clock tonight, which is when
Hmm.
most people come home and make dinner. If that sort of thing happened on the day when it was 108 for the first time in 5 years, then you'd
Hmm.
say, oh, the grid is being stressed. But if it's happening many evenings, that's
Yeah.
a fragile grid. That's a
Okay.
grid that's easy to break, as opposed to a grid that you better be up to 108 before we're going to notice what is
Right.
happening here.
Right. Okay, so we're moving from a stressed grid then to a fragile grid into one that potentially breaks, right? It is sort of
Yes.
the progression of that. And so I mean I spent some time and listeners will know I've been to Puerto Rico and spent some time there, and that grid system there is finally, after I read your book, I understand it, right? It's the most fragile, I think, or the most stressed I've ever seen, because the power just goes out for 3 days, right?
Yes.
The last time the power went out where we were there, they had a New Year's blackout, the whole entire island for 3 days during the New Year. And then we went in April and it was the same thing. It's like, you're trying to get your work done and you can't because there's no power, right? And then so all of a sudden you don't have water. There's all these other things that kind of sort of dovetail off of no electricity, right? It gets pretty messy. I think another thing that I picked up from your book is, we focus, like all the people that we've talked to for the most part up to this point are focusing on, oil and gas and generating that power or getting the fuel to generate the power. But then there's this whole other part of transmitting it, right? And that's sort of where my gap came in. But could we talk about the difference between generating it versus the transmission part and break it down so that my 6-year-old son could maybe understand it?
Well, that's a very hard thing to ask. I will just say that basically there's two main levels of transmission and distribution.
Okay.
Transmission is the big high voltage wires that run long distances.
Okay.
And then distribution is the wires around your house. They've already been stepped down to much lower voltage at various substations, and they're around your house. Another thing is the transmission grid. I call it a grid, but it isn't actually squares. It's a network. One line goes down. It's designed so that, in general, the current will be rerouted around other lines so that it doesn't just flop.
Yeah.
And that's called N-1. What I mean is that the grid is supposed to be good enough to take N-1, that is some large thing happening, and just keep working along.
Okay.
But N-2 is much harder to take. So you don't want to get to an N-2 situation. At any rate, so that's the grid. It's a network. Meanwhile, at your home, it's more of a tree configuration, because
Right.
you don't have two different ways to get power to your home. If
Mm-hmm.
your line part of the tree is broken, they got to
Right.
fix that part. End of
Yes.
story. And so there's that. Then there's other things that are kind of confusing. You can't overheat the lines, which means that sometimes you can't put electricity on a line if it's almost full. If you remember in my book, I have that a little thing where the Vermont people were complaining that ISO New England was curtailing their renewables. And
Yes.
the answer was, well, when we have to curtail something for safety, or
Mm-hmm.
yeah, we do.
Right. Yeah.
And so if your renewables were about to overheat the line,
Mm-hmm.
okay, you're getting curtailed.
And I see that too. Is this similar then? Is in California we have these massive wildfire risks, right? We have a lot of
Gosh.
brush and it's common. But was this similar to my utility company shutting down power for 2 days because it's windy and, they don't want to have any sparks from the transmission lines? Is that similar?
It's sort of similar. Lines are rated to carry a certain amount of.
Right. So they don't want to overload the
They
lines.
don't want to
Okay, I gotcha.
overload it. But the thing about California is, let's face it, they have not been keeping up their transmission system as well as they should. I always want people to read my book, and so I want you to all go out and read Shorting the Grid. But
Right.
then after you finish my book, I think it'd be good if you read California Burning,
Okay.
which is the history of the wildfires and PG&E's role in it and so forth.
Gotcha.
So anyhow, but remember my book first.
Yes. Yeah, well, that at least it gives a good base layer for understanding the next one, right? And that's I think part of it. Yeah.
People get very upset about being curtailed. I
Mm.
mean, the renewables are very upset about it. Now, one of the things is that a renewable, usually if you're a coal plant, you get paid when you put some electricity on the grid, and your
Mhm.
payment is more or less the equivalent of the electricity you put on. I mean,
Right.
there's different facets of it. Different, there could be your capacity payment, your energy payment, whatever. But meanwhile, if you look at a renewable, the renewables get a lot of their income not by the kilowatt hours that they get paid for, but by the grid. The grid pays them for kilowatt hours, of course, but they get more than what the grid is usually paying them from production tax credits and selling renewable energy certificates.
Hmm.
Now, the renewable energy certificates and the tax credits are only for when they put electricity on the grid. So if they get curtailed, they
Hmm.
not only lose the money they would have gotten from the grid, they lose the money they would have gotten from I think, the federal government for the tax credits, and
Right.
from other utilities who would buy their renewable energy certificates.
Hmm.
So, I don't even know how to say it except that the renewables are desperate to be online. They're so desperate that they're willing to bid in at the auctions at, like, we'll pay you 2 cents a kilowatt hour to take our
Yeah.
power, because once
Right.
we've paid you the 2 cents, we get
Right.
the REC, we get the production
Yep.
tax credit, we're good.
So the tax credit conversation around anything with renewables is huge. I mean, even talking to buying an electric vehicle, it's so funny. There's so many credits that go into all of this, and carbon capture sequestration and 45Q credits, and the list goes on. But I think the incentives are important to kind of see, like, what is the incentive of the renewable, why is it there, and I think it's a net positive at the end of the day. I think we need all of these sources of power, but it's interesting to see the economics of why they're trying to get where they're going.
Let me just say for a moment that we could run the country with a very low carbon grid with baseload nuclear
Hmm.
and natural gas and hydro filling in the rest.
Interesting. The more I learn about nuclear, the more interested I am in, continuing my education on it. But we'll have to hold that thought, I think, for a moment
Yeah,
here.
absolutely. But I mean, the thing is, do we need renewables? And the answer is that they're great where they work. But let's look at solar for a minute. Solar is available in the daytime, which is great because that's when most electricity is used, but not all. And then it goes away at sunset. Well, the thing is that many utilities peak right after sunset because
Right.
people go home, they turn on the AC, they turn on their stove to make a little dinner, they turn on the
Hmm.
TV. In other words, there's a post-sunset peak, especially in the winter. So what I'm
Yeah.
trying to say is that, when you say, oh, we need the utility, we need solar, we use solar, it's fine. But
Hmm.
I don't know what you can say about needing it when it's not there at peak.
Totally agree with you on that. It's and it makes me think of batteries, right? So, trying to understand where batteries kind of fit into this whole equation. Maybe solar could, be held in a battery storage for temporarily and then put back on the grid. I don't know. But I mean, we've had so many issues with battery plants catching on fire here in
Yes.
California. I mean, there's been 3 of them within, I think, the last 12 months. And then there's a fire actually, I think, in the LA harbor right now with there's a cargo container that's full of batteries that caught on fire as well. Actually, probably still going. But I mean, where do batteries fit in with maybe the renewables part? Is that something that you see as economic or not so much?
I don't see it as economic. I hate to say that, but I don't see it as economic. I think we'd be better off backing up renewables with natural gas. Because, I mean, natural gas is explosive, whatever, but people really know how to handle it. There's not a lot of natural gas disasters happening, certainly not three in one state in 1 year.
Right. And that's interesting that you say that. It lines up with exactly what I saw is we have all these data centers that are going online and natural gas is just projected to continue, up and to the right because it's potentially the best source of power that we
Yes.
have. Along the lines of data centers, there's this whole conversation of behind the meter versus in front of the meter. And there was an article I saw where there was proponents of this thought that data centers should be creating their power behind the meter. So effectively on their own site, creating that power and then using it instead of having the costs spread out over the ratepayers. I look at that like that becomes quite challenging. I mean, both sides of the argument. Should the ratepayers be paying for it or should it be? But I mean, the infrastructure to build power generations, it's not necessarily an easy task along with everything else. So, I mean, how should we think through that problem where data centers are going to keep consuming more power and rates are going to go up and, all this? There's such a hard conversation to even think through. But any thoughts there?
Not even sure that I completely believe that data centers are going to cause power prices to go up. In
Okay.
general, if you don't build anything more, but you use what you have at a higher percentage rate, the prices will go down.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying? In other words,
Yeah.
if I can sell more, I can have people pay less and I'll make the same
Right.
amount of money. A volume. I mean, in other words, the difference between a boutique and your local supermarket
Right.
is
Yeah.
which one's going to be the more expensive food.
Right, right. Whichever one my wife is not shopping at, right? For the most part. And you guys heard it here first. I mean, that's a great way to kind of flip it on it, the problem on its head, right? Is looking at, I'm reading this article and I'm focusing on the words that are being written. But then if you can zoom out or talk to somebody or read a book and get a different perspective on how to solve the problem or think through it, I think that's a critical piece here.
I
Um,
just want to say one more thing, and that is I'm not predicting that data centers will lower the price. I'm just
yeah,
saying that that's as much of a
yeah.
possibility as the opposite, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, it's supply and demand, right? And
Yeah.
and I'm fixated on one politician that's saying something, right? And it's like, oh, let's zoom out a little bit and everyone just relax. It's going to be okay. We'll figure this out, right? So, going back to my local utilities and we haven't even talked about RTOs yet, which a lot of your book focuses on
Yes.
the politics. That can be, I think that's like a whole nother podcast episode. But my question as I'm reading through your book is, there's these community meetings where it's like, okay, your utility company is going to host it and everyone's going to come in and they're going to talk about why your bill's going up $20 a month, or you're going to see this new fee, but we want your feedback. Right. And they invite everyone over. And typically it's the older retired folks that show up to these because, let's face it, they're on a fixed income. And $7 a month, it could be concerning even. And but really what I'm asking here is, I've been to those meetings and I've listened to both sides, and I'm not sure that those meetings really have any effect on the utility company or the RTO outcomes.
They don't.
Well, help me understand this.
No, they don't. I'm going to tell you quite honestly, they don't. I mean, when I was in consumer liaison group, several people who were in the consumer liaison group were also in the participants committee
Hmm.
of the NEPOOL. And now in the participants committee, you can't join that committee without a financial input. I mean, you have to pay every year to be in
Yeah,
that committee. And if you're a consumer, it's not very much money. It's like $500 a year. But you
yeah,
can see by my saying consumer and $500 not much money
yeah,
that
yeah.
the big guys are paying a lot more to be in that committee.
Sure.
And those committees are listened to, but things like the consumer liaison group, I mean, one of the people who was in it said, it's just a place to have coffee and chat.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Well, I was hopeful that wasn't my impressions weren't consistent, but it sounds like they're right up there with it. It feels maybe that there's no way to control, especially in a region where the RTO controls the market, right? I only have one option for my utility company where I live. I
Yes.
don't really have a say in anything. I mean, I can't even vote with my wallet.
No, that's right. You can't even vote with your wallet. That's one of
Yeah.
the problems about utilities, which are it's this weird blend of monopolies from the customer's point of view, and infighting for the subsidies from the different participants' point of view.
Well, I will leave some of the negativity behind. I want this to be more of positive thought and engineering and all the other maybe interesting things coming up in the future. But for those of you listening that maybe aren't familiar with RTOs or FERC or any of these other entities that are involved in this, again, I'm going to point you back to the book, or at least start with a Google search if you don't have the book in your hands. I'm going to move on to kind of another burning question. This is one that I have on my sheet here that's highlighted in every color and bold. So I wanted to make sure I
Oh
didn't miss
dear.
this one with you. I know. Don't get too excited though. It's probably inconsequential. Um, we have these data centers, and then another conversation that I have often with my younger brothers is kind of around this cryptocurrency Bitcoin thing, which I'm not intimately familiar with it, but what I have seen, and I don't know if this is something you're readily familiar with, but these cryptocurrency miners believe that they're helping stabilize the grid because they can shut off their mining systems, right? So they might be using a lot of power, so we'll shut it off when more power is needed throughout the day for consumers. So the argument they're making is that, well, we're producing a thing of value, which is this cryptocurrency, and we should be building more of these because we can help stabilize the grids. I don't know if that's a valid reason or not, but I mean, does it help the grid when we create these sort of pockets of high demand that can be shut on and off, more regularly, I guess, or without less consequence?
Well, I would say that your average dispatcher would love to be able to control demand at the same way that they control supply. In other words, they dispatch this plant because there's need for plants, and then they
Yeah.
undispatch it when the need goes down.
Hmm.
And I think they'd love to have the same control over demand. I don't even want to speculate about it. I've talked to
Yeah.
people ask me to talk to groups, and I've talked to cryptocurrency groups, and I can understand their argument. I just don't know enough about it to say, oh, yeah, you're definitely stabilizing the grid.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, and I'm always wary of marketing pitches, right? Where it's like, well, we want to get this accomplished because hey, we're going to make a lot of money doing it, but what's the net downside to it? And so I think again, it's like trying to learn how to see everyone's perspective on it, and if it's not something that's widely known, right, and we can't really point to data on it, I'm just curious how that might roll out over the next couple of years. We'll see. Texas especially and Wyoming are the two states I'm thinking of as talking through it the most. But again, I mean, Texas, their economy is oil and gas, right? It's power generation. I mean, it's that's what they do, right? So I'd hope that they would have some leadership there from ERCOT, even thinking through some of the grid implications. So
Well, I hope so too, because I mean, I think that whether we understand it or not, a stable, reliable grid is one of the really important things for a civilization. I mean, you don't have prosperity, good health care, lots of, go into a hospital and everything's being sterilized while you're waiting
yeah,
and all this sort of stuff, the autoclaves are going and everything. What I mean is that it's very needed. It's extremely needed. And intermittent electricity is a big burden on
hmm
people. So I just hope that it all works out. I feel like I need to follow stuff that's going on the grid, and that's what I do. But
hmm
I really can't follow, like, what's new with cryptocurrency. I don't know.
right.
I don't know.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. There are people in that space that are doing it and are having those conversations, right? It's just it's learning, who can you trust and who do you want to follow, right? And I'll be honest, when I started reading this book, I went into it with the sense, like I do with most things, is like I want to disagree with the author, right? I almost go in defensively. Like I don't want to
Yeah.
disagree because I want to come out on the other side fully convinced or fully understanding both sides of it. So your book lays it out perfectly, and I know we're here to talk about more than that, but that's been such a great guidepost. So thank you for that. I was hoping to ask you maybe one more question, and this really revolves around there's this thought that has kind of come up for me in talking to people over the last 5 years, where with oil and gas sometimes, or in general, the comment is made that we just take energy for granted, right? Like we plug our phone into the socket, we turn on a light, and we take it for granted. And I think I'm starting to see, believe it or not, maybe I spend too much time talking about energy. So maybe my narrative mentally is shifting, but I feel like that might be changing a little bit, right? I think we're becoming more energy conscious as a people because our power is starting to brown out or go out, or, they're starting to do more of this stuff where maybe we're thinking about it more. But, you know, the language of everything, the way that everything is written and presented is so complicated. And I guess what are ways for people like me, regular people like me, how are we able to kind of improve where all this is headed and I think educate others about what we're looking at? I don't even know where to start. Like, I mean, obviously pointing them to the book and having them read it or asking them to listen to a podcast about it. But just a normal person living their day-to-day life, how do we think about energy? Or is it just something that it's just going to be that way until the power goes out?
You can explain to people that low energy areas are not wealthy areas. You cannot have a high wealth, high life expectancy,
hmm
highly efficient infrastructure area that's also low energy. And so
Okay.
basically, keeping the power reliable is very important. Now, the thing is that what happens is if you begin going too far that way in talking, then people are like, "Oh yeah, another prepper," you know.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and I don't. I'm not a prepper. I
Yeah.
just think electricity is really important for our civilized life. Am I prepping for not having it? No, but part of that is that I'm just so old. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
mean to say I'm just one foot in the grave and the other on a banana peel, but what I'm saying is that I just don't feel I can set up my life now to be a
hmm
prepper, and
Right.
I'm not.
I like the connection that you draw between, the need for power and civilization, right? I mean, that's the bottom line of how that should be kind of talked about, I think, is if we don't have it, then we can't be prosperous. I think that at the end of the day. So we need more power and we need to talk about this more on a regular basis and raise awareness for it, I think is another part of it. Gosh, I know I asked a lot of questions that maybe seemed left field. Your book made me think through some things that I'd never thought through before. So you're my first person that I've had to maybe think through some of these things with. So I appreciate your tenacity and hanging in there with me while I'm going through it. But, thank you for coming on, and please give people a, handoff for where they can find you and where they should get your book.
Okay, well, you can find my book, Shorting the Grid by Meredith Angwin, on Amazon. And also, if you go to your local bookstore, you should be able to order it
Yes.
because it's also on Ingram Spark, which supplies the local bookstores. That doesn't mean that the local bookstore is going to stock it necessarily,
Hmm.
but you should be able to get it through your local bookstore. And then in terms of me, my suggestion is that you might follow me on X, which used to be Twitter, and that
Yes.
you also, I have a Substack, the Electric Grandma Substack, and I don't post enough, but you can follow it. I also recommend following Robert Bryce's Substack. There are two people, Mitch Rowling and Isaac Orr, who write a Substack called the Energy Bad Boys Substack. Actually, if I begin listing Substacks, I could be here for a week.
Meredith, this has been such a fun conversation for me, and just a breath of fresh air, honestly, with interviewing an author and a self-published author at that, and going through all this, and just the writing process and how you got where you're at. So yeah, I hope you have a fantastic day. And for everyone listening to Local Energy, we should have Wade Spear back here on our next episode. We miss him dearly, but he's out there doing great things on the oil field. So anyways, until then, until we see you again next week, thank you guys for being here.
Thank you for having me on your show.